Thank you, Senator Canavan. Senator McDonald.
Thank you very much. And I rise also to speak to this legislation and amendments because there is probably no other topic more important in Australia than water and water management. And it doesn't matter whether it's in the Murray-Darling Basin, whether it's in the north of Australia. Water is the thing that we all have the most interest in. But water management is a very different thing when you're on the ground in those communities to when you're sitting in an office in Canberra or possibly even trading water, where it becomes an economic asset that is a very highly valuable product, but can drive communities that rely on water assets to the very brink. Now, Senator Canavan has already touched on the removal of farmers and agricultural workers from the Murray-Darling as a basis or following the buybacks of water. This is devastating to those communities, and this was always a central tenet of the development of the Basin Plan, was that there wouldn't be, or that there would be, a measurement of socio and economic impacts on Australians, because there has to be a balance on these things. And as we know, that the best environmental outcomes are only achieved when communities are thriving and when communities are successful. And so the buybacks, particularly in the kind of patchwork way that they've happened, the piecemeal way that they've happened, has meant that there have been some farming communities that are no longer viable or are struggling to put together the infrastructure and support that's necessary to support industries, cotton gins, farming, processing, the kind of repairs and maintenance that's needed for tractors and heavy machinery as it operates in those systems. So the practical result of the discussion that we're having has enormous impacts on farmers. And it is devastating to hear the impact on dairy farmers who have not been able to— well, and Senator Patrick, I'll take that, because of course you're not interested in farmers. You're only interested in focusing on certain parts of the community, and so I'm here to talk about the people who have the least voice of all, which is the agricultural industries and farmers who grow the food and fibre, who keep our communities vibrant.
Senator McDonald, just one moment. Senator Patrick, could you please stop interjecting? Thank you. Senator McDonald.
Thank you very much for that assistance, because it is important that those with the least voices, somebody speaks for them. And they are doing the job that is the most important for not just Australians but a good part of the world, which is growing food and fibre in the most sustainable way. And you would reflect on what's happened in the cotton industry, in grains, in dairy, in the beef industry, where we're seeing the kind of innovation, practical development of crops and animal production that uses less water, that is highly efficient and sustainable, and we should be proud of that. We should encourage that, rather than taking away the very resource that makes them possible to operate in this land. And talking to dairy farmers who have been pushed out by the increasing competition for water is just heartbreaking to hear of those people who over generations have developed herds that have had to be sold off and they move out for a replacement crop, mostly almonds, which of course make delicious nut juice. That's one of the real products that's now come out of the competition for water. But what I do want to talk about is we have, during estimates, a whole day on water, particularly on the Murray-Darling Basin. And there was a lot of talk about efficiencies, on-farm efficiency programs. And again, I would ask people to reflect on the very practical result of being on-farm and what this means. There are not just measures about usage on-farm, but better efficiencies of flows, making sure that streams are clear of weeds and obstacles, making sure that water is allowed to run efficiently to the next point. because these are the sort of very practical measures that Australian farmers are able to deliver. And it is enormously frustrating to hear people talk from offices and a long way away about what is the best decision to make when it is farmers who, with their hands in our soil, in Australian soil, make decisions to grow the crops that we all rely on.
Senator Patrick.
Thank you very much, Chair. So the government has made a series of buybacks over many years, and I know that when Senator Wong talks about purchasing 1,000 gigalitres from farmers, this was water purchased during the Millennium Drought, when farmers and communities were at their lowest, and farmers who sold their water at that time in sheer desperation were told it was the worst decision that they have ever made. How tragic for those people and their families to have to look back at a decision, at a negotiation that they had with their own government and consider that that was the worst decision that they have ever made. Because it is practical efficiency, practical work for on-farm decisions that end up with the best environmental outcomes that we can have. And I reflect on the work that's happened in the reef catchments, where it has been the government signals and messages, the provision of practical programs that has allowed Queensland farmers to improve the way water runs off their land, how they apply fertilisers and how they operate on their farms. In fact, that's been so efficient that it has resulted in a 25% reduction in nitrogen runoff. It has resulted in the latest Reef Water Quality Report card of an A for improvement for water quality. And I think that is extraordinary, and I have been disappointed that for all the rhetoric, for all the discussion about water use and water quality, there has not been one acknowledgement from those opposite, not one acknowledgement of the work for farmers, of the stress and the heartache of making significant changes at significant cost to themselves. And when those changes of land management has resulted in these better outcomes and better efficiencies of water and cleaner water, there has not been any acknowledgement. And it's no wonder at all that farmers are really wondering what the point is. What is the very purpose of them getting up and doing the work they do because they feel that Australians no longer care, no longer even want them to be farmers? And I know that as I travel around Queensland, the number of times that farmers have ended up in tears, because they believe that nobody believes in what they do anymore. Nobody believes in them, and who's going to provide the nut juice for coffees? Who's going to provide the plant matter for vegan food? Who is going to provide the very excellent vegetables and fruits and meat that Australian farmers grow? Because without the sort of managed and balanced basin plan that we are trying to provide these amendments to allow for, who is going to do that? Because farmers are certainly not. They are broken. They are broken by the crazy costs of water, by the crazy lack of understanding from some parts of our community. So these amendments will achieve environmental outcomes as if the 450 gigalitres was in place, but the outcomes will not be measured by the use of water. It will be measured by practical, on-farm, on-land management changes, because we're now seeing this need for a holistic approach, a broader approach to managing the environment. I mean, a great example is where you can have an environmental watering event that may see the growing of a rare native grass. That grass is required by a rare native bird to lay their eggs. But unfortunately, the eggs will all be eaten by wild pests and animals if we don't fence off the grass and provide a safe nesting habitat for the birds. So we're widening the scope to fund fencing required to protect the vital bird breeding events. And I'm seeing this kind of fencing approach create incredible outcomes in Queensland, where wild dog exclusions have meant that there are koalas returning to parts of southwest Queensland that previously it was blamed on tree clearing, despite there being little or no tree clearing in those regions, blamed on tree clearing when the actual culprit was the incredible number of wild dogs that were out hunting off the land of native animals. And these dogs grew. They exploded in numbers because of the number of watering points that graziers and farmers had introduced right across Western Queensland in what was previously arid and semi-arid lands. And instead there's now watering points to provide for more kangaroos. And so there is now such a number of roos, such a plague of roos, that if anybody has ever driven in the west after dark, you know it's not safe to do so in a vehicle without a bull bar and some protection, because it is a threat to life and limb. And so the sort of projects that we're seeing, practical projects that allow for native animals to rebound. And one farmer in Western Queensland told me that the previous year he had only had 300 lambs survive. 300 lambs, because he would go out night after night and see lambs torn apart by dogs hunting not for food and not for survival but for the sheer pleasure of it. But after the introduction of the exclusion fencing and the removal of wild dogs hunting purely for pleasure in packs, he was able to mark 4,500 lambs. What an extraordinary change. And this is the same farmer who tells me that he now sees koalas that he hasn't seen in his generation. So there are many ways to achieve environmental and other outcomes in the Murray-Darling Basin than just buying back water from farmers. There is efficiency of water flows, there's on-farm practices, and there is other ways to achieve the kind of environmental outcomes that everybody wants to see. You know, the disappointing part about this debate is that some would like to see the world in black and white. They'd like to see bad farmers, bad agriculturalists, because they couldn't possibly want to see good environmental outcomes. They couldn't possibly want to see better outcomes in the place that they live, the place where they raise their own children, the place where they may have lived for generations. That couldn't be possible, could it? Because instead you'd rather paint those people as terrible, terrible people. That lack of understanding is shocking and it's distressing. And so I say to Senator Patrick and others here, I do speak for farmers. I do speak for people in the regions who don't have enough voices in this place. And that kind of balance is what we're trying to achieve through this debate, because if we truly believe in democracy and we truly believe in good outcomes, we know that good outcomes are achieved when there is a lot of voices and there's a lot of different points of view and we can provide balance. But the sort of science that some people refer to, because saying science over and over again does not actually make it real. Saying science over and over again, when I hear the Greens and Senator Patrick talk about science, they rarely refer to it back to a point. They refer to some mythical number, mythical kind of magical cloud of science that's going to support their particular, potentially uneducated and unuseful view. So I do stand to speak on this. I barely feel I need to go on with the discussion that's going on in the chamber. But how healthy to see this kind of debate happening at a grassroots level, because I never interrupt Senator Patrick when he speaks, but somehow my voice is less important than his. It's very discourteous. I ask you not to do that.
Senator McDonald, one moment, because I think you make a good point. Senator Patrick, could you please stop interjecting? It's not that hard. Thank you. Senator McDonald.
So I would just finish on this note, that it is the exchange of good ideas, the exchange of different points of view that gives us the best outcomes for Australians right across this country. It gives us the best results, not just for the environment, but also for the very important people, Australians who live in regional places.